Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to show you how I work with JSON data in SQL Server. I'll go over how to select individual values and objects, work with complex, nested JSON structures, and finally how to update and modify JSON data. JSON is everywhere. Instead of having to write a separate application to work with JSON data, I'll show you how SQL can help complete a lot of that work. So let's get started. So I'm in my SQL Server and I have a variable called data that's just a JSON string that has three keys: name, favorite sport, and skills. And skills is an array, and name and favorite sport are just individual values. Now, what's the first thing I typically like to do? Well, whenever I'm working with JSON data, I always want to check if this is actually a valid JSON structure. So to do that, you can actually just use this isJSON function, and you pass in your JSON string, which is this data variable here, and then we can call this as, let's say, isValid. This will return a 1 if this is a valid JSON structure. So for example, if I were to change this and remove it, this is still a valid string, but this is not a valid JSON structure anymore. So if I run, this will return 0 now. So it's a really quick check to know if your JSON data is correct and valid at least. Another quick tip I found when working with JSON, especially in SQL Server, and when you get to work with more complex JSON structures, an example, in this one here, I have a new JSON structure that's very nested here. And if you see when I run this, I'll kind of see the full string and it's pretty long. So you can actually do, as a quick tip, is right click on this, click on copy, then go into like a code editor like Visual Studio Code. And then I'm in Visual Studio Code here. Then in my files, I can right click, click on new file, call this test. Just make sure it ends in JSON, call it whatever you want. And then either control and hit V or right click, hit paste. You'll see the whole JSON structure is listed here. Then what you can do is left click anywhere here and in this file, right click again, click on Format Document, and then it will actually format your entire JSON structure for you. So it'll be a lot easier to see. So for example, if there's something that's missing, it'll actually show up in red here and then help you try to fix it. So just another quick tip that I can show you there. Now, what if you just want to grab individual elements from this JSON structure? Let's say you want to grab John or tennis. How do we do that? We can use this JSON value function. And again, you pass in your JSON string, which is that data value variable here. And then the next argument is this path argument. And what this says, where do you want to grab the element from? So for example, if we're passing the entire string of data here, you always start with this kind of $sign, which means start at the current context, meaning start at the beginning of this string, since you're passing the whole string in. Then you use a dot to indicate go inside of this structure, and then what key do you want to grab? You want to grab name to get the value for that key. And then we can say this is name. This will grab us John. Same thing if you want to grab favorite sport, we can just grab this here. Now, one thing that's really important is path in JSON is case sensitive. So for example, if I were to select a capital name here instead of lowercase, and if I try to run this, I'm gonna get a null value. So you have to make sure it's the correct key, the exact case sensitive piece that you're using here. Another thing to note too is whenever you're working with JSON data, there's two modes you can work with. Okay, the default, which is the one here, is what's known as lax. Same thing if I was writing it like this. This is lax. So if a path doesn't exist, this will return you a null value. The other mode you can use is strict. And what strict does is if a path doesn't exist, then actually throw me an error in the code, right? In either case, if you pass in the correct value, then it will give you the result back. And now, when do I typically use either of these two modes? If you have more a dynamic structure, so let's say, for example, you have users all the time, but let's say they might not have a favorite sport. This key might not exist. And maybe you want to use lax to say, hey, if this key doesn't exist, just throw a null in that column. But if you have more a strict JSON schema, for example, these three keys have to be there, then maybe you want to use strict to say, hey, if this favorite sport doesn't exist, then throw an error. Another thing to note is when you were working with keys, instead of favorite sport, let's say there's actually a space in your key. So to handle this, if you actually try to select like this and you do fav sport, it's going to throw you an error. That's because there's actually a space in this key. So if you ever have spaces or special characters in your key, the way to handle this is you just wrap the key name in double quotes. And then when you run this, it'll allow you to bring in whatever you wanted to do. Now, what if you want to grab a object? Okay, if you see these were individual elements, what if I want to grab skills, which is an array of 3 elements here? If I try to use JSON value, this is not going to work and give me that null value because JSON value only extracts individual, or what's also known as scalar values from a JSON string. To actually extract an array or object, you have to use a different function called JSON query. And now if I run this, and I'll switch this to skills here, you'll see that it grabs me that array. And same thing, you can use lax or strict. And again, it's case sensitive, but it just grabs you objects now versus individual elements. Now, what if you wanted to grab an element inside of the array? Let's say we just wanted to grab SQL or Python or Azure. How do we do that? Well, because we're grabbing an individual element, you want to go back to JSON value. And then what you can do is inside of skills, you actually use this open and close bracket here. And what this means is go inside of the skills object. So go inside of here, and then what element do you want to select? So this is a zero-based index, meaning that start with 0, meaning grab SQL. Now if I want to grab Python, I can go to 1, or Azure, I can go to 2 and grab that. Now, what if you want to grab multiple values? You can also do that. Let's say, for example, here, you can mix and match. So let's say we want to grab the name value, we want to grab Azure, which is that last skill, and we also want to grab skills as the array. You can run this and still grab all the elements that you want to. Now this is really nice if you're just grabbing a couple of elements or objects, but if you're grabbing more things or you're working with more complex nested JSON, this can get pretty complex and not very efficient performance-wise. So I'll show you how to use OPENJSON and Cross Apply to work with more nested, complex JSON structures. So now that we've seen how to work with a simple JSON structure, how do we work with more complex structures and return those values in inner JSON objects, inner arrays? So I'm going to jump into a new file, and I have a new variable called Pokemon. And I also listed it on this in Visual Studio Code, just so you can see as we're going through how I'm working with this and what this looks like. I'm going to jump over here now in the right side, and you're going to see in this structure, we have the following things. We have a key called Pokemon, and in Pokemon, we have an array, and then a JSON object. It has item, ID, num, name, weaknesses, which is another array. So this is an inner array inside of this object. Okay, then we have gender %, which has a space in it, which we'll have to handle, which is another JSON object that has male and female that's broken up. And then we have another JSON key called evolves_to. That's an array with 2 keys, num and name, inside of it. And there's also a couple of items in this array. Then we have another Pokemon called Ivysaur, which is the evolution, if you know Pokemon at all, of Bulbasaur. I've removed one of the weaknesses just to show you some different data, see how this is going to look. And then I've also changed the gender % to a different numbers. Then if you see we have an evolves from. So this is the Ivysaur evolves from Bulbasaur. Then evolves to Venusaur. But if you see in our first element, we only have the evolves to because Bulbasaur is the entry level Pokemon. It doesn't evolve from anything. And so we'll have to see how to work with this when this evolves from is here, but not in this first one. So how do we actually start to work with this more complex JSON data? Again, I have it defined here as a Pokemon variable. And if we go down here, the first thing we want to do is let's actually make sure that this is valid, which it is. Now, what we're going to start to use is this JSON, OpenJSON function. Now, what OpenJSON does, this is a table valued function. That means that this OpenJSON function just returns a table as a result. So it'll return a series of columns and rows depending on what we pass in to this function. So for example, if we pass in Pokemon, which again is this full string here, we're going to be using what's called the default schema. When I run this, it's going to give you the top level keys of your JSON object and the value inside of them. For example, the top level objects or keys in our structure is Pokemon and status. We can tell this because if we go here, we see Pokemon, and inside Pokemon is everything listed here. And if you see status is another top level key. Now, the other thing to note with OpenJSON is you want to make sure you're using SQL Server 2016 or greater. To be able to check that, you actually right-click on your database, click on Properties, click on Options, and make sure that your compatibility level is at least 130, so is SQL Server 2016 or higher, to work with the OpenJSON function. All right, now, default schema, when we run this, will return you 3 columns. The top-level keys, like I mentioned, the values of them, and then the type. So this type is, for example, type 4 is an array. So SQL is saying, hey, I found an array inside of this Pokemon key. And then status is just legendary, which is just a string, which is type 1. You can see type 5 is object, key value, right? And then null is type 0 and so on. Now, you can also do, is you can provide a path to the OpenJSON function. Say, actually, I just want to dig into this Pokemon key. So again, we pass in the $, which means start right at the beginning since we're passing in the full variable, and then show me Pokemon. If I go into there, it's going to give me 2 keys, 0 and 1, because remember, this Pokemon is an array. So it's saying it found this first key is 0, and then the second key is 1. And then again, the values are all those inner JSON object in there. And these are type 5 because since we're in the array, these are the actual JSON object, key value pairs. Now we can also go into the first element. See, let's go to the first item in Pokemon. And return this, now we get the inner keys. We get the top level keys inside of this structure. So we get ID, num, name, weaknesses, gender, evolves to, and so on. You see they're all different types. Like type 2 again is number for ID and so on. Now, this is great to see your overall level of JSON. But what if you want to actually work with some of these inner structures? How do you break up some of these elements here and items? So we can also do an OPENJSON, is you can pass in and be explicit about your actual columns, which then allow you to work with that structure later on. So we can actually do is use this with clause. In this with clause, we can define the actual schema of this JSON and of the data we want to work with. So for example, remember we had those two top level Pokemon and status were the initial keys. So I can actually define those. We could call this, let's say Pokemon, and now varchar max, and I'll explain why this is varchar max in just a second. And the path is a $ Pokemon as JSON. I'll explain why that's there in just a second. Then we'll do status. Okay, we'll do varchar, let's call it 20, and the path is this $. Now, when I work with this, what you'll see is we're returning two columns called Pokemon data and status. Now, why did I put varchar max in this as JSON? Whenever you want to work with JSON data further, so you want to actually work with the inner JSON objects. For example, this object, this array inside of this object, and so on. You have to tell SQL Server that you actually want to work with this further. To do that, what you do is when you define your column, if you're ever working with a JSON object, you have to make sure it's varchar max. Because if I were to give this, let's say, varchar 500, this is going to fail. You could say when you're specifying as JSON, you have to put varchar max. That's why you have to put varchar max here. Okay, and again, what this as JSON says is SQL Server. This is actually a JSON structure that we're going to work with a little bit later, or to make sure that this is a JSON structure. And status is not because it's just an individual value. It's just this legendary string, and that's it. Okay, now we've broken this up. So now we have the array here. Now, how do we work with more data? Let's say we actually want to work with ID, num, and parse some of these values out. This is where cross apply comes into place. Now, another thing we can do here is we can alias our table name. So this table name is called P1, and it contains a Pokemon data column, which is a JSON object, and then a status column, which is the legendary string. Now what we can do is we can do what's called cross apply. And I'll explain what this is in just a second. And now we can apply the OPENJSON function. And let's say we want to grab more data inside of this Pokemon data object. So what we can do is we could say P1, which again is the name of the table I just defined. Then we can say go into the Pokemon data column and then work with this data further. And I'll explain what cross apply does at the end here. All right, but again, same thing as we did up here. We actually define a with clause. And we could say what's inside of this Pokemon data column. So the top level elements is ID, so we could say ID. Right, we call this int, and the path is $.ID, because again, we're inside of this structure now. And again, this is case sensitive, so make sure you lowercase this here, right? The next one we can do is number. We'll call it number, and varchar 3, because again, this is a string, and the path is going to be .num, and then we'll do name, varchar, let's call it 20, name, and then weaknesses. Now, weaknesses is another array, but again, since we see this as an array now that we might want to work with further, how you define it is the same thing that we did above. Your weaknesses, you varchar max, and the path is this $.dot weaknesses as JSON. So again, we're explicitly telling SQL Server this is another JSON object that I might want to work with further. All right, and then when we run this, you actually see what happens. Now, to go back to cross apply, what is cross apply doing? Think of cross apply as like an inner join. And what it's doing is it's saying in this Pokemon data column, I want you to grab the ID number, the ID, the number, name, and weaknesses. We want to specify and make these as columns and then apply this to my table. All right, so it's just going to say again, grab these items and then apply it to this table. That's why you see two rows now. You see the ID of 1, that's Bulbasaur, and you see the number now, and you see weaknesses is this array here, right? Then you see ID 2 of Ivysaur, and it listed again those 3 elements in there. So it parsed all of this for us with weaknesses. So again, it's just applying this OPENJSON function with these columns across this table here. What if we actually want to break down weaknesses further? What if instead of seeing this as an array, we actually want to have multiple rows? So for example, what we want to see is number 1, Bulbasaur, and the first weakness should be fire, and then another row with O1, Bulbasaur, and weakness should be ice. Because we want to normalize or unpack our data here. So how do we do that? Same kind of thing. We can define this as P2. We'll put this as P1. Now we can do cross apply again. And we can do OpenJSON. And now we want to pass in. We want to pass in P2. So we want to get this table and then pass in this column that we want to unpack further. Okay, weaknesses. And then again, we can define a with clause here. And then we can say is, we'll call this weakness. It's going to break up our weaknesses. Let's call it 50. Then what's the path? The path is just a $sign. It just means there's no nested keys in here. There's just a flat structure here. So you just do this $sign for that. Now if we run this, we'll call this as P3. Now when we run this, you'll see it's breaking up our data now even further. And you'll see here, we have Bulbasaur 1 of fire, we have Bulbasaur 1 of ice, Bulbasaur 1 of flying. Then it broke up Ivysaur of fire, ice, and flying, which was those 3 elements in here and 4 elements here. You might be wondering, these are a lot of columns. I don't really want to see all of these columns. You can pick and choose whatever data you want. For example, let's say we just want to grab the individual elements now. So what we can do, we can say P2 dot, I'm going to grab ID, because again, it's in this P2 table, we're going to grab ID. Then we're going to do P2 dot number, P2 dot name. Now, we don't want to grab this one, because this is the array. We want to grab the individual items here. So to do that, instead of P2, we can go to our 3P table, where we unpack this. And we can go P3 dot weakness. That's how we define the column name. Now, if we just run this, you'll see now it's broken up into these things. We can see now how it's trying to unpack a lot of our data here, which is great. Now, what if we also, let's say, want to get gender percent? Again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cross apply, open JSON, and then what we want to do is we want to define where this key, what level it's on. And since it's on this same level as these guys, then we go in, we can do gender percent and varchar max, because again, it's a JSON object that we want to work with later on. Okay, and because there's a space here, and again, if you remember, we use the double quotes and double quote again to grab that. And we say as JSON. And then what we can do, since we defined it up here, now we can go into cross apply and we can do P2, and we want to grab that gender percent column. And then we define our with clause again. And we could say, let's see, let's call it gender percent male. And we do a decimal 3, because again, there's 3 numbers here. I want to go one number after the dot here. And the path is this dot male. Then we do the same thing, gender percent female, close this. And then what we want to do is we can call this as P4. Then what we can do is go up here and we can say P4 dot gender percent male, and then P4 gender percent female. And then let's run this. Now if you see, it's breaking up into these columns here. So again, what is cross apply doing? It's taking this column, gender percent, and then saying, give me new columns called gender percent male, gender percent female, and applying it across all of our rows of our data set. So that's why you see it's broken up into all these rows. Now, as a last one I'll show you is, if you see here, there is a evolves from and evolves to. Evolves from is listed in our Pokemon 2 Ivysaur because it's evolving from Bulbasaur, but in Bulbasaur we don't have that. So how does this actually work? Again, it's still defined in this level here in P2. So we're going to do evolves from, again, in varchar max, and the path we're going to pick is, again, this evolves from as JSON. And now we can do cross apply. Now remember, we have 7 rows listed here, 4 for Bulbasaur and 3 for Ivysaur. Now watch what's going to happen here. If we just do cross apply JSON, and we do P2 dot evolves from, so again, grabbing this column, then we define our with clause, and then we say there's 2 elements in this object. There's num and name. So we'll do like evolves number, and we'll do this as nvarchar 3, and we'll do $sign dot num. And then we can do evolves from name nvarchar 3 dot name. Now, what do you think is going to happen now? Because remember, it's looking to do an inner join. So what it's doing is it's taking the evolves from It's going to search in each of these items in the array. It's going to search for this evolves from key. And then it's going to make columns called evolves from number, evolves from name by taking these values. Evolves from is not listed in this one here. So again, if you see, we have 7 rows here. But if I run this, let's call it P5. Okay, and then we'll grab these columns here. So P5 dot evolves from number, P5 dot evolves from name. Now, if you see, we just lost all the Bulbasaur data. Why did we lose that? Because if you see, oh, I'm sorry, whoops, let me make evolves from name should be like 20 here. Now we got Bulbasaur here. Now, why did we lose all the Bulbasaur data? Why don't we have Ivysaur data here? It's because cross apply is like an inner join, like I mentioned. So because it can't find evolves from as a key in this array, it can't do an inner join. And so it just removes that data set because it can't apply this function to that first object in the array. So how to actually fix this? So instead of doing a cross apply, there's actually another one you can do called outer apply. And what outer apply does is it says, I want you to apply this OPENJSON function. So this evolves from column, unpack all this data right here. However, if you don't find this key in one of these elements, for example, first object, if this key is not listed there, still return this data and just return it as a null value. So now if we do outer apply and run this, you'll see we get the Bulbasaur data back, and now it'll just have null values for it. So if there's a key that's missing, you don't see one here, you can use outer apply to still say, look, grab me all of the information still, even if this key is missing in this particular object. I think of outer apply as like a left join. So still saying bring in all the data still from this object, and then give me the stuff that's inner joining as well. Now the next thing we'll go into is how to actually modify JSON data. In the last part of this video, I'm going to show you how to update and modify JSON data. So we go back to our original JSON string that we had with 3 keys called name, favorite sport, and skills. Skills is an array. And again, we have that in a variable called data. Now, how do we update JSON data? So let's say we want to update a single value. Let's say we wanted to update the name John to Steve. To be able to do that, you set your data variable. So we're going to update the data variable. Then we're going to pass in this JSON modify function. And the first argument you pass in is the original JSON string that you want to do. So again, that data variable, which is this whole thing. And then we go, and the second argument is what key do you want to update? So we're passing in this $, which again, it just means since we're passing in this entire string to start at the beginning, and the dot, and then go into the name key, then update the value from John to Steve. So then when we run that, you'll see that the name has been updated to Steve instead of John. Now, what's the next thing we might want to do? What if we want to actually create a brand new key? So if you see, again, you set your data variable, pass in JSON modify, pass in your string, and then we're going to create a new key. Because age is not a current key right now, SQL says this doesn't exist. I'm going to create a new key called age. Then we're going to pass in the value of 18. So if I run this, you'll see that age was created as a new key, and the value was 18. Now, one important thing to note is, again, just like everything that we've looked at in this video, JSON is case sensitive. So if I were to pass in a path and actually call this age with an uppercase, it's actually going to create 2 keys, one with lower age and one with upper age. So be very careful. That's why strict can come into play, as this will stop and block and say, hey, this path doesn't exist. So just again, to make sure that you're very careful about case sensitivity in JSON. Now, what's one of the next things you might want to do? One of the things you might want to actually create a new array. Right? You see how skills is an array? What if you want to add a new array called new skills? So to be able to do that, again, we're going to use JSON modify. We create a new key called new skills because it doesn't already exist in our original string. And then we're going to pass in this string called soccer and then football. But now if you see, this is actually going to return escaped values, which we don't want. And you see the backslash, another backslash. So by default, when you're passing in arrays and creating a new array, SQL Server will automatically escape your JSON values. To stop that from happening, what you can do is actually go in and pass in this instead. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm using JSON modify, create a new key called new skills, but then I'm passing in this JSON query. So what the JSON query, if you remember in the original beginning part of the video does, is it tells SQL Server we're going to pass in a JSON object. And then when you run this, SQL Server is going to assume that this is a valid JSON object that we're passing in. Then we pass the exact same value that we did. And then when we update that, you'll see that it now does it without those escaped values and it goes in correctly. Now, what if we wanted to append a new value to an existing array? Let's say we want to add a new item to an existing array skills. To do that, you can add this append keyword. So we again use JSON modify, then we use the append keyword, then we say in our current key skills that already exists, append a new value called REST APIs. Now, if you also want to use strict or lax, you just add this, right, or lax, which again is the default. And then when you run this, you can see it added REST APIs at the end of our array. Now, what's the next thing we might want to do? What if we actually want to delete an actual key? To do that, again, pass in JSON modify. Then we're passing in this existing key that already exists. And then because we're in the lax mode, which again is the same thing as writing this in the default, if we pass in a value of null, that's going to tell SQL Server to actually delete this entire key. So when we run this, you'll see that name was completely deleted from our JSON string. Now, what if we wanted to not delete the key, but actually set the value to null? So instead of John, we want to update this to null because maybe we're not sure what the name is at the given time. So to do that instead, you pass in the exact same stuff, JSON modify. Instead, you pass in the strict mode. Then you use this in key and then null. So this is telling SQL Server, look, this key exists. I actually just want to update the value of it to null instead of deleting the entire key. So then if you run this, you'll see that the name is updated to null instead of John. Now, how do you update multiple objects? Let's say you want to update multiple values at the same time. So JSON modify can only update one item at a time, but to update multiple, what you can do is you can use multiple JSON values at once and multiple JSON modifiers at once. So how this works is you pass an original JSON modify or outer JSON modify. Then you can pass in an inner JSON modify. It says in this inner JSON modify, I want you to take my data, right, variable, in the existing key name, update the value to Sammy, and then in the last argument, then I want you to append a new value to skills called data factory. You could do 3 of these, 4 of these, 5 of these, however many you want to. I'm just doing 2 for an example. Then when you run this, you'll see that the name was updated to Sammy, and then skills was data factory was added as a new skill. And again, you can do as many as you want to. Now, the last part I'm going to show you is how do you rename a key? Let's say we want to rename this name key to first name. To do that, pass in JSON modify. And then you're going to pass in an inner, again, JSON modify. You're going to pass in your JSON string you want to update. We're going to pass in a new key because first name does not exist yet. So this is going to create a new key called first name. And then the value of first name, we're going to look up the existing value of this name key. I'm going to say, hey, what's the existing value of name? It's going to look up and see John. And then in the outer part, the last argument, then what we do is because we're in lax mode, it's going to take the existing key and it's going to actually delete that key. So it's going to create a new key called first name, then delete that name key. So then if you see, at the end, it created a new key called first name with John, which was the original value, and deleted the old key name. So that's how that works, and I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the video and let me know. Thanks for your time.